Have you ever wondered how a single family could dominate finance, hold immense sway over railroads, steel and electricity, and even bail out the U.S. government? The Morgan family is a striking testament to unparalleled wealth and influence during the industrial age. From Miles Morgan, a Welsh immigrant, to the colossal banking empire built by John Pierpont Morgan, this family left an indelible mark on global history. But behind the staggering figures and groundbreaking achievements are their secrets yet to be unveiled. They rose to power and contributed significantly to society, yet also found themselves at the center of rumors, controversies, and conspiracy theories, spanning everything from the Titanic to mysterious trust funds. In today's video, we'll dive into the secrets of the Morgan family, covering everything from their origins and multi-billion-dollar fortune to the hidden stories behind their gilded legacy. Let's get started. Let me invite you on a journey back to the days when colonial trade routes were shaping the economic future of North America, and when a family by the name of Morgan stood at the brink of transformation. Imagine the hustle and bustle of early port cities, where ships packed with goods would come and go, forging new fortunes from markets that were once thought impossible to reach. That's where we first meet Miles Morgan, an individual whose colonial trade ventures were far from extravagant by modern standards. Yet they laid the groundwork for a financial empire that would one day redefine the words old money. It's a story of ambition, risk, savvy marriages, philanthropic endeavors, and a flair for art that eventually saw the Morgan family rival the cultural collections of other illustrious names. But it's also a tale rooted in the stark realities of the Gilded Age, when fortunes could be made or broken overnight, and when accusations of conspiracy and financial manipulation often swirled around any titan of industry who climbed too quickly up the social ladder. From the start, Miles Morgan's efforts in colonial trade resembled what the Cabots did in shipping, sending vessels across the Atlantic to bring back goods that the colonies desperately needed, while also exporting raw materials to European markets. At the time, these trade ventures were considered new money, meaning wealth that hadn't yet had time to settle into multiple generations, gain aristocratic polish, or acquire the kind of long-standing social acceptance that marks old money. Colonial society could be quite stratified. Families whose roots stretched back to the earliest land grants, or those tied to European nobility, tended to look askance at brash newcomers, especially if those newcomers earned their fortunes in ways deemed unseemly. Shipping, although critical to the colony's economy, was often seen as less genteel than owning land or holding a government post. Still, trade was the primary avenue through which many early American families accumulated enough capital to establish a bigger footprint. And though Miles Morgan's ventures were modest, they planted the seeds of expansion for later generations. Over the decades, as America evolved from a patchwork of colonies into an independent republic, the Morgan family continued to pursue opportunities, particularly in finance and industry. The real turning point arrived in the 19th century with John Pierpont Morgan, better known as J.P. Morgan, who rose to dominate American banking to such an extent that his name would become shorthand for financial power. When the country entered the Gilded Age, new fortunes exploded onto the scene, often in railroads, steel, oil, and finance. It was an age of staggering economic growth, but also glaring income inequality, labor strife, and unregulated markets. In this environment, J.P. Morgan set up a banking empire that not only advised major corporations, but orchestrated mergers, reorganizations, and bailouts that shaped the destiny of entire industries. For instance, he helped form the world's first billion-dollar corporation, U.S. Steel, by consolidating several major steel producers under a single umbrella. Newspapers of the time marveled that such a deal could even be accomplished, especially considering the enormous sums of money involved. This banking dominance was so transformative that it was often compared to other major families' control in separate sectors, like the Mellon family's influence on the oil business or the Rockefellers' near-complete grip on American petroleum. Yet the Morgans understood something crucial. If you want to move from new money to old money, raw financial power by itself isn't enough. There has to be a patina of social respectability, a sense of belonging to the cultural and philanthropic traditions that old money families treat as their birthright. Accordingly, J.P. Morgan poured enormous amounts of time and resources into philanthropic efforts. He championed the Morgan Library, which housed not just books but also rare manuscripts and art pieces that showcased the breadth of his cultural interests. He loved collecting art with the same zeal others might have for collecting exotic flowers or rare stamps, except his acquisitions were often worth fortunes in their own right. Renaissance paintings, ancient sculptures, medieval tapestries, and countless other treasures. At one point, the total value of his art collection was estimated at around $50 million in 1913 dollars. To put that into perspective, that sum outstripped what entire museums might have spent over decades building their exhibits. And it wasn't just about having a private hoard of cultural gems. Morgan donated or eventually bequeathed many significant works to institutions that made them available for public viewing. Just as Andrew Carnegie became famous for funding libraries, the Morgan family became associated with grand art patronage, effectively establishing themselves as tastemakers in an America hungry for cultural prestige. Marriage alliances formed another essential element of the Morgans' shift to old money status. J.P. Morgan's marriage to Frances Tracy tied him to a social circle populated by other powerful families. Think of it as a careful blending of dynastic influences that mirrored the tactic once practiced by the Medici. The Medici had cemented their power in Renaissance Italy through alliances with various royal and noble houses. And while the Morgans weren't exactly mingling with titled royalty, the social, political, and financial benefits were not so different. Within American high society, certain family names carried immense weight. Marrying into those families meant forging unspoken partnerships that could lead to favorable business opportunities, philanthropic collaborations, and deeper trust among the financial elite. Even so, the Morgan saga is not purely about philanthropic greatness and social ascension. It's also riddled with controversies. While J.P. Morgan could certainly come across as a benevolent figure, particularly when he stepped in to stabilize the financial system during market panics, he was also accused of stifling competition, influencing markets in ways that benefited his own interests, and, in some instances, even conspiring behind closed doors to drive smaller enterprises out of business. This contributed to a lingering stigma of new money impropriety. The idea that the Morgans had not yet fully shed the aggressive attitudes associated with rapid wealth accumulation. Critics sometimes lump them in with other families caught in major scandals, like the Dohenis, who were famously implicated in the Teapot Dome affair. Although the Morgans were never part of that particular scandal, simply being mentioned in the same breath signaled suspicion of behind-the-scenes deal-making. Political cartoonists loved depicting J.P. Morgan with a large, almost cartoonish nose and a top hat, overshadowing the Capitol building or stuffing enormous bags of money into the coffers of his enterprises, imagery that stuck in the public imagination. Despite these criticisms, the Morgan fortune was truly astonishing, encompassing a wide range of assets. In banking alone, they helmed J.P. Morgan and Company as their flagship institution. That bank, together with other financial enterprises they influenced, provided the capital for railroads, factories, and large-scale infrastructure projects that knit the country together economically. It was also connected with established banks that had been around since the early 19th century, which gave the Morgans a claim to a lineage stretching back to the formative years of the United States. Alongside these financial endeavors, there were significant stakes in major industries. U.S. Steel, General Electric, and various railroads fell under the Morgan sphere, giving the family an almost unrivaled capacity to shape markets. So on one side, you had a philanthropic champion who brought Renaissance art to the New World and donated to museums and libraries. On the other, you had a financial czar with direct or indirect control over the essential infrastructure of an entire continent. Real estate was another key piece of the puzzle. As New York City transformed into the nation's economic center, the Morgans acquired valuable properties in Manhattan. High society in those days was heavily focused on who owned property on Fifth Avenue or in other fashionable enclaves. The family also invested in estate properties outside the city, including a retreat known as Cragston, which allowed them to entertain influential guests away from the hustle and bustle of Manhattan. Real estate, in addition to providing a steady source of income, functioned as a display of stability. If you had the resources to maintain multiple properties, complete with grand architectural flourishes and carefully landscaped gardens, it signaled a long-term permanence that mere speculative earnings could not. In the eyes of high society, that helped set the Morgans apart from the truly nouveau riche. Yet, families like the Vanderbilts serve as a cautionary tale about how quickly vast sums of money can dissolve through poor management, lavish spending, and internal disputes. Cornelius Vanderbilt had built a shipping and railroad empire so colossal that his descendants were once among the wealthiest in the country. Within a few generations, however, that fortune had largely disintegrated. By contrast, the Morgans adopted strategies that echoed the methods used by families such as the Cavendishes, who had carefully crafted trusts and inheritance structures to ensure their wealth survived far beyond one or two generations. That doesn't mean the Morgans were free of legal battles. Like many wealthy clans, they occasionally faced family members contesting wills, trust allocations, and overall management of the family's assets. These disputes cropped up in court documents from time to time, generating attention in the press. Some of these battles chipped away at the unity of the Morgan fortune, but the underlying framework endured, and a significant portion of their assets remained intact, sustaining their influence. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan's philanthropic gestures took center stage whenever the family's image needed some polishing. Imagine standing inside the Morgan Library, with its ornate woodwork, rare books, and manuscripts that date back centuries. You can practically feel the presence of a Gilded Age titan who genuinely believed in preserving knowledge and culture. The Metropolitan Museum of Art benefited from Morgan's donations, too. Visitors might find themselves marveling at Renaissance paintings or priceless artifacts that once belonged to him. In this way, the Morgan name became linked not only with big money, but also with intellectual refinement and social responsibility. By quietly funneling massive resources into the public sphere, the Morgans tapped into a long-standing tradition of philanthropy that figures like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller also embraced, though each man had his own philanthropic focus. Carnegie fixed his sights on education and libraries. Rockefeller leaned into public health and scientific research, and Morgan found his muse in art, literature, and historical treasures. This generosity did not erase the controversies, though. People kept a watchful eye on Morgan's dealings in the financial sector, especially when rumors circulated about market manipulation or sweetheart deals. There were moments during financial panics, particularly in 1907, when J.P. Morgan famously corralled major bankers in his personal study and pressured them to collaborate on rescue packages to prop up failing institutions. While the public breathed a sigh of relief at the time, some critics argued that no individual should wield so much power that he could effectively act as a one-man central bank. Skeptics claimed he was prioritizing institutions in which he had a direct stake, although historians continue to debate how fair or unfair that criticism was. Eventually, concerns about the concentration of financial power contributed to calls for an official central bank, culminating in the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Ironically, the same year J.P. Morgan died, the United States was laying the groundwork to ensure the country's financial system would never again hinge on the benevolence of a single mogul. When people talk about the Morgans, they often mention J.P. Morgan's imposing physical appearance, a large man with a prominent nose and a piercing gaze that made him look every inch the image of a financial czar. Political cartoons delighted in amplifying these features, sometimes portraying him towering over the White House with puppet strings attached to politicians. This public perception fused admiration for his brilliance and philanthropic gestures with fear of his market-shaping power and rumored backroom schemes. While this duality painted J.P. Morgan as a somewhat intimidating figure, it also contributed to the family's mystique. Eventually, as philanthropic initiatives continued and the memory of his more controversial moves softened, the Morgans took a firm place among America's old money families, with a social aura more reminiscent of established aristocracy than of upstart financiers. It's often said that behind every great fortune lies a murky secret, one that, if revealed, could drastically change the way we perceive the wealth and power of the elite. When we think of J.P. Morgan, we imagine towering skyscrapers, grand libraries filled with rare books, and a legacy of high culture. Yet the road to his family's rise was built not only on legitimate industries, but also at times on less savory ventures that would have remained hidden from the public if not for careful scrutiny and keen historical research. One of the most controversial and speculative secrets behind the Morgan fortune revolves around the family's early involvement in the opium trade, particularly during the 1830s when Joseph Morgan III, an early ancestor of J.P. Morgan, is believed to have smuggled opium to China. This dark chapter in the Morgan family's history provides a stark contrast to the image of cultured, philanthropic heirs of banking empires that the family would later cultivate. Historians have long speculated about the Morgan family's connection to the opium trade, with some credible sources suggesting that the family's early shipping ventures were not as innocent as they might have seemed. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, Joseph Morgan III's shipping activities may have included illicit shipments of opium to China, a practice that was commonplace among American traders during the 19th century. Opium, a highly addictive drug, was in high demand in China, and American merchants were all too eager to fill the void. These illicit shipments allowed traders to amass vast fortunes, even as they remained, at least in the public eye, respectable businessmen. The opium trade was not the only avenue of wealth generation, but it was certainly a significant one, especially when considering that these profits helped fund early banking ventures, including those of J.P. Morgan himself. The fascinating part of this story is how this potentially dirty money, concealed behind the guise of trade, laid the groundwork for the financial power that would later define the Morgan family. Just as Roosevelt's early ventures in opium influenced his rise in political power, The Morgans' illicit dealings helped seed the capital that would be funneled into banking. It is crucial to understand how these smuggling activities were intertwined with more legitimate businesses, which would later blossom into the world-renowned J.P. Morgan and Company. This dual nature of their fortune, one foot in murky waters, the other in polished financial institutions, helped the Morgans balance their image, cultivating a mix of high society respectability and the powerful financial muscle that money earned from darker means. Now let's dive deeper into the specifics. Research into old shipping logs, such as those of Etna, which was known for its trade operations during that time, or Boston trade records from the 1830s, could potentially shed light on the opium connections. While it's difficult to pinpoint the exact documents that could provide conclusive evidence, the possibility that the Morgans were involved in opium smuggling during their early ventures remains very plausible. These records, buried in the archives of old shipping companies and financial institutions, could provide the missing link in understanding how profits from illicit trade funded the rise of one of America's most influential banking families. This type of research would mirror investigations into the trade practices of other historical figures who were involved in similarly shady dealings, such as the Cabots and the Astors. Both families, known for their own wealth built through shipping, have been implicated in unethical ventures, including opium smuggling, which further highlights the role such profits played in the establishment of major financial empires. In terms of framing this as the opium ships behind a banking empire, we need to place these early trade ventures in the broader context of the times. The 19th century was a period of fierce competition among nations and businesses. Empires like Britain and America in particular were expanding their influence across the globe through trade, often exploiting the weaker countries they encountered along the way. The opium trade was a key part of that expansion, with British merchants and American traders alike sending opium into China in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. It was a profitable but morally dubious business, with devastating consequences for the Chinese population, who became ensnared in the addictive drug trade. Many American families of means during this time participated in the opium trade, whether openly or through intermediaries. The Morgans, through their early shipping ventures, are believed to have been one of the families involved in this network. While the Morgan family's involvement in the opium trade is not widely documented in historical sources, there is strong speculation that they were at least peripherally tied to it. Speculative claims of vast opium cartels, claims which are echoed in some historical works, are yet to be proven with definitive evidence. However, it is well established that the early American merchant families, including the Morgans, were not above engaging in such dealings to secure wealth. Historical records from the time period, including shipping manifests and personal correspondence, hint at these darker connections but rarely provide full confirmation. The absence of clear evidence doesn't necessarily mean the involvement was any less real. It simply reflects the era's lack of transparency when it came to dealings of this nature. If we take a closer look at the family's rise to financial dominance, particularly in the context of the opium trade, we can better understand how J.P. Morgan's banking empire was built on more than just legitimate financial dealings. The profits from illicit trade ventures like these could easily have been funneled into more respectable enterprises, including the establishment of banks that would later shape the financial landscape of America. Morgan's rise from modest colonial trade to the founder of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world makes a lot more sense when we consider how these early profits might have helped build his banking legacy. In fact, it's a pattern seen in many of the wealthiest families of the Gilded Age, money from the opium trade, slave trading, or other dubious activities often formed the backbone of their later legitimate business ventures. Moreover, the social and cultural impact of these financial gains cannot be overlooked. J.P. Morgan, a man who later became known for his patronage of the arts, his acquisition of rare manuscripts, and his massive art collection, would have had no shortage of wealth to indulge in his passions for the finer things in life. His family's early connections to the opium trade helped generate the kind of wealth that made it possible for him to build the grandiose Morgan Library and Museum, a symbol of his cultural legacy. This juxtaposition, on one hand, a wealthy banker with a taste for culture, and on the other, the possible hidden origins of that wealth, provides an intriguing, albeit uncomfortable layer to his legacy. Let's not forget that many wealthy families during this period, particularly those involved in shipping and trade, had deep ties to the opium trade. The Cabot family, for example, became known for their large profits from opium, which helped them establish their own fortune. Similarly, the Astors, who built their empire on fur trading and later real estate, are also believed to have been involved in the opium trade in their early days. These families, like the Morgans, were not only part of a vast financial network, but also major players in the establishment of America's wealth. The fact that these dynasties, who helped shape the landscape of American finance and culture, were often built on profits from such illicit ventures raises important questions about the ethics of wealth accumulation during this period. When we start to pull the threads of these families' financial histories together, it's clear that the opium trade was not just a footnote in the rise of American banking and industry. It was a key component. The smuggling of opium to China under the guise of legitimate trade helped fund many of the institutions that later became the powerhouses of the American economy. For the Morgans, these early profits from opium trade were crucial in helping them transition from colonial merchants to influential bankers. As we've seen with families like the Cabots and Astors, wealth derived from the opium trade often led to the establishment of even greater financial empires. And though these connections were often kept under wraps, the stories of these dynasties reveal a fascinating, if uncomfortable, truth about how wealth, power, and influence were built in the early days of American capitalism. The question remains, how should we reconcile this hidden aspect of the Morgan family's rise with their later, more public legacy? Can we appreciate the cultural contributions they made, like the Morgan Library and Museum, while acknowledging the unsavory origins of their wealth? This is a question that history continues to grapple with, as the legacy of families like the Morgans is intertwined with both greatness and moral ambiguity. While J.P. Morgan may be remembered for his contributions to American banking and culture, the shadow of his family's early involvement in the opium trade lingers in the background, a reminder of the complex and often uncomfortable foundations upon which even the most illustrious fortunes are built. Picture yourself on a crisp April morning in 1912. Manhattan's elite are buzzing about the greatest floating palace ever built, the RMS Titanic. And the city's most powerful banker, John Pierpont Morgan, is said to be boarding her in first-class splendor. He has reserved a lavish suite, complete with a private promenade deck, the kind of quarters only the Napoleon of Wall Street could command. Yet, at the last minute, Morgan scratches his name from the passenger list, deciding instead to linger with his art purchases in France, and according to friends, take the cure at a spa for his failing health. Less than a year later, he will be dead, but his abrupt change of plans on that spring day becomes the seed of a legend that refuses to die. when the Titanic vanishes beneath the North Atlantic on April 15th, taking more than 1,500 souls with her, including Morgan's social rival John Jacob Astor IV, department store titan Isidor Straus, and copper heir Benjamin Guggenheim. The rumor mill ignites. Did Morgan know the ship was doomed? Did he seize the tragedy as a chance to thin the ranks of fellow millionaires blocking his path? The whispers begin in newspaper gossip columns and survive, Phoenix-like, through radio shows, paperback pot boilers, and, most recently, viral X posts that accuse him of outright sabotage. Professional fact-checkers have repeatedly debunked those posts, noting there is no evidence Morgan altered the ship's design, cargo, or route. But conspiracy talk is stubborn, especially when gilded egos and sudden death intersect. Part of the magnetism of the story lies in Morgan's hidden leverage. He was the spiritual architect and majority shareholder of the International Mercantile Marine Company, the vast trust that owned the White Star Line and thus the Titanic herself. In the Progressive era, reformers thundered against Morgan's railroad money trust, but his grip on transatlantic shipping drew less heat. Privately, IMM was drowning in debt. Publicly, the House of Morgan projected unsinkable confidence. When IMM's jewel went down, its bond prices wobbled and the company lurched toward a 1915 receivership, a tumble Morgan's enemies would later hail as poetic justice. Economic historians now see the sinking as the first domino in IMM's long collapse, a wound later widened by World War I and antitrust scrutiny. Yet Edward Doheny Teapot Dome scandal, another Gilded Age morality play, shows how differently the press can treat two titans. When Doheny's secret Elk Hills oil leases surfaced in the 1920s, his name was splashed across every front page, and Senate hearings turned him into shorthand for corruption. Morgan, by contrast, dodged that level of exposure over Titanic. Reporters rarely linked him to IMM in banner headlines. A century on, historians still debate whether the disparity reflects Morgan's media savvy, the complexity of maritime finance, or simply the public's focus on the tragedy itself rather than the money behind it. If you love detective work, the archival trail is rich. IMM board minutes, surviving passenger manifests, customs declarations for Morgan's art cargo, and telegrams between the banker's Paris hotel and his New York office. Scholars hunting for a smoking gun focus on timing. Morgan skipped the sailing on April 10th, but he had in fact moved his reservation more than a week earlier, amid press chatter that a pending French export law might trap American art on European soil. Titanic experts George Behe and Don Lynch note that the law never materialized, but the rumor meshes neatly with Morgan's lifelong devotion to old masters' paintings. Another plausible motive? At 75, he was frail, plagued by headaches and chronic nose infections, and may simply have followed his doctor's orders to rest. Still, conspiracy culture thrives on coincidence, and Morgan supplied it in spades. Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus, three men with pockets deep enough to bankroll competing empires, really did die in the sinking. That stark fact feeds the notion of an orchestrated cull reminiscent of the Plantagenet drama, known as The Princes in the Tower, where two royal heirs vanished in 1483 after their uncle Richard III seized the English throne. Every generation rediscovers that medieval mystery. Just last year, a newly found gold chain linked to Edward V rekindled debate over whether the boys were murdered or survived under aliases. The Titanic myth echoes that centuries-old template: remove the obstacles, inherit the future. Modern finance has its own eerie corollary. In 2018, Matthew Mellon, great-grandson of tycoon Andrew Mellon, died suddenly in a Mexican resort while holding hundreds of millions in cryptocurrency keys, known only to him. Documentary filmmakers dubbed the saga a crypto mystery because the fortune effectively vanished, sparking lawsuits and online theories of foul play. Like Morgan, Mellon mixed high society, big money, and a technology the public barely grasped. And, like Morgan, his untimely absence became a blank canvas on which armchair sleuths painted elaborate plots. So did J.P. Morgan sink his rivals? The case for sabotage usually rests on three pillars. First, his IMM shares allegedly ensured him a colossal payout if Titanic went down, but marine insurance of the era aimed to restore ships, not enrich owners. And IMM's filings show the policy barely covered construction costs, let alone generated profit. Second, critics point to design compromises, fewer lifeboats, subpar rivets, as evidence of a setup. In reality, those decisions trace back to cost-cutting and regulatory blind spots, common across rival lines. Third, conspiracy writers note that Morgan helped draft the Aldrich Plan, a blueprint for a U.S. central bank, and claim Astor opposed it. Yet Astor's private papers contain no attack on the idea. He spent 1911 remodeling his Fifth Avenue hotel, not lobbying against monetary reform. Meanwhile, the hard evidence for innocence is mundane but persuasive. Morgan's canceled ticket appears in White Star's ledger weeks before sailing. No frantic telegrams instruct the captain to speed through iceberg fields. No cargo manifest lists dynamite or sabotage devices. The Marconi wireless logs, meticulously preserved, show routine business messages until the night of the collision. And after the disaster, Morgan poured money, not champagne, into relief funds, underwriting hastily convened hearings that ultimately tightened maritime safety laws under the New Solis Convention. Why, then, does the myth endure? Partly because Morgan epitomizes the moral ambiguity of high finance. He rescued the U.S. Treasury during the Panic of 1907, yet provoked public fury for wielding quasi-governmental power without democratic oversight, an anger that helped spur creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. When a figure this polarizing steps away from a catastrophe that kills his peers, the human mind craves pattern. Too convenient to be chance, we mutter, forgetting that randomness often trumps design. Social media amplifies that instinct. A single meme can reach millions before historians even boot up their laptops. Reuters analysts track these bursts of misinformation in real time, labeling the Titanic sabotage narrative unfounded, and noting its viral spikes coincide with anniversaries and movie reruns. Astor's widow, Madeline, pregnant and just 19, became a living symbol of both loss and resilience. She inherited roughly $5 million, plus an annuity that soared with wartime inflation. Guggenheim's daughter Peggy later fueled the modern art movement, collecting Jackson Pollock and hosting salons in Venice. Strauss's family endowed hospitals and schools. Ironically, Morgan's progeny enjoyed no such romantic glow. When he died in a Rome hotel on March 31, 1913, the New York Stock Exchange closed until noon in mourning. Yet newspaper tributes were tempered by progressive reformers who blamed him for monopolistic abuses. His corpse was shipped home in silence, his face rumored to be bruised by years of chronic rosacea, proof, the tabloid said, that even emperors of money could not buy health. On the corporate side, IMM staggered on. It defaulted on bond payments in 1914, entered a friendly receivership, crawled out in 1916, and finally morphed into United States lines before succumbing to bankruptcy in 1986. Historians who parse IMM's ledgers find no smoking gun profit from Titanic's loss, only mounting costs, declining passenger demand, and relentless competition from Cunard's speedier ships. The tragedy that supposedly enriched Morgan in fact accelerated the unraveling of his maritime empire. Let me tell you a story that might sound a bit like a hidden chapter in an old financial drama, yet it's all too real. Picture yourself in the early 1900s. Wall Street is buzzing with speculation, and everyone's chasing the next big thing. Then, in 1907, the stock market takes a terrible tumble, and banks begin to topple like dominoes. People are running to withdraw their money. Rumors are flying around like confetti at a parade, and nobody seems to know which institution might crumble next. Into this chaos strides none other than John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan for short, one of the most powerful bankers in American history. According to the New York Times, Morgan orchestrates a massive bailout that ultimately saves Wall Street from total meltdown. But here's the secret twist. While he was busy playing hero, he was also buying up distressed assets at bargain basement prices. And so the question arises, was this the selfless act of a modern-day savior, or was it something more like an opportunistic power move that padded his fortune? If that question gets your blood pumping, you're not alone. Historians, journalists, and curious onlookers have been wrestling with it for decades. Official accounts say Morgan's intervention was a turning point in calming the panic of 1907. The country was about to crack under the strain, and Morgan stepped in with promises, capital infusions, and a kind of behind-the-scenes pressure to make banks, trust companies, and, frankly, any major financial players with a pulse do whatever was necessary to stop the collapse. On the face of it, that's an incredible act of leadership, maybe even patriotism, some have claimed. But lurking in the background like a shadow in a dimly lit alley are these secret deals. The New York Times references them quietly. Historians mention them in scholarly articles. And various blogs and websites hint at how Morgan allegedly profited by snapping up assets for next to nothing. Sure, it saved the financial system in the short run, but it also made him wealthier than ever, akin to those notorious payoffs we saw under the Umayyad Caliphate, where tribal leaders would get lavish gifts or hush money to keep alliances sweet. It might sound far-fetched to compare a titan of American finance to medieval tribal bribery, yet the principle, some would say, isn't that different. Grease a few palms, rearrange some power structures, and come out on top. Speaking of power structures, let's bring in another piece of the puzzle, the Federal Reserve. You may have heard that the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, officially came into existence in 1913, a few years after the crisis. Now, it's no coincidence that the Panic of 1907 is often cited as a driving force behind its creation. According to Wikipedia and multiple reputable news outlets, including the Washington Post and Business Insider, the 1907 crisis exposed glaring weaknesses in the American banking system. There was no central authority to inject emergency liquidity or step in decisively to keep smaller institutions from going under. The conventional narrative says that once Morgan and other private financiers managed to halt the crisis, Congress took note. Leaders realized that relying on a single powerful banker to stabilize the entire national economy wasn't a sustainable plan. Hence, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, designed to provide a more systematic safety net. But behind that official storyline is a question. Did Morgan's deal-making, his efforts to acquire assets at rock-bottom prices, offer the very example that highlighted the need for a centralized public structure, rather than leaving it all to the benevolent generosity of one man? Dig a bit deeper into the drama, and you discover all sorts of side stories. There's talk of how the panic started with an attempt by F. Augustus Heinze to corner the market on United Copper Company stock. When that scheme failed, panic spread to banks associated with Heinze. Soon enough, depositors lost faith in a range of financial institutions, culminating in massive runs. Morgan, as the de facto leader of the American financial sector, started orchestrating closed-door meetings, yes, literally locking bank presidents in his famous library until they agreed to certain bailout conditions. But according to some investigative pieces and references found in archives from the New York Times, Morgan was also scouring the financial landscape for deals that, in ordinary times, wouldn't have landed in his lap so cheaply. It's reminiscent of those moments in history when power players exploit chaos. Think of the Habsburg monarchy, known to leverage electoral bribes and deals for more power, or Andrew Carnegie's approach during the Homestead Strike, where some see a heroic job creator, others see a man who crushed a labor movement and used the aftermath to strengthen his empire. Morgan's alleged profiteering might not be exactly the same, but the pattern is there. In times of crisis, a well-positioned figure can rewrite the rules and shape the aftermath to his advantage. And that's why historians sometimes call this the bailout that built a fortune. This phrase, the bailout that built a fortune, captures the narrative that Morgan not only stabilized the economy, but also enriched himself. Critics and skeptics alike have pointed out that if you're in a position to dictate terms, you can practically steer the outcome to your benefit. They argue that Morgan demanded certain concessionary stock offerings in exchange for providing liquidity. Others say the deals were more roundabout. For instance, by stepping in to save the Trust Company of America, Morgan could choose who got the rescue funds and under what conditions. Once trusts and banks had no leverage because they were desperate for capital, Morgan's terms reportedly became the only lifeline in a sea of drowning opportunities. Imagine you're in a desert dying of thirst, and the only person with water is also the one setting the price, and that price might be more than you'd ever pay under normal circumstances. Now, there are definitely commentators who disagree with the notion that Morgan was actively profiteering. They might say he had to step in because no one else could. They'll cite the frantic days of October 1907, how close the country came to a total collapse, and they'll emphasize that Morgan eventually came out of it with his reputation battered by accusations of manipulation. Some argue that if his sole intent was to profit, maybe he would have orchestrated the entire panic in the first place. But that's the rub. There are indeed X claims floating around, mentioned in some blog posts or obscure articles. The original text references X claims of deliberate panic post-zero, that Morgan not only capitalized on the panic, but may have fanned the flames to accelerate it. However, the original note cautions us that X claims of deliberate panic lack proof. Indeed, historians have not found a smoking gun that Morgan triggered the meltdown. Most likely, the run on the banks was an outgrowth of earlier events, and Morgan reacted strategically once everything was in free fall. Regardless, it's widely acknowledged, even by more conservative historians, that Morgan's cloak and dagger deals happened in secret. It wasn't like he held a public press conference to say, "Hey folks, guess what? I'm about to pick up these assets for pennies on the dollar while you're all freaking out." That's why it's reminiscent of those ancient political power plays, like the bribery tactics the Umayyad dynasty used to keep rival tribes in line, or how the Habsburgs reportedly used financial incentives to maintain control over various European territories. In all these scenarios, money changed hands quietly, alliances were secured, and once the dust settled, a few key individuals or families came out on top. Now let's explore the idea of profiteering in more depth. According to both academic articles and Wikipedia references, profiteering typically refers to making an unreasonable profit, especially in times of economic distress or crisis, by taking advantage of shortages or monopolistic conditions. The Panic of 1907 was precisely such a crisis. Banks were failing, trust companies were losing depositors by the hour, and the entire system seemed on the brink of dissolution. If you were a financial baron like Morgan with enough capital to float around, you could theoretically demand terms that would never fly under normal conditions. Essentially, name your price. That scenario is precisely why some scholars or critics call it profiteering. Though, keep in mind, in the eyes of Morgan's supporters, it was simply an example of supply and demand. He was the only game in town, the argument goes, and so of course he was able to command a higher return for his assistance. Interestingly, this sort of scenario isn't unique to the banking world. The original content references Carnegie's Homestead cover-up. Andrew Carnegie, another titan of the Gilded Age, faced the famous Homestead strike in 1892 at his steel plant near Pittsburgh. Publicly, Carnegie presented himself as a benevolent industrialist, building libraries and championing philanthropy. But behind the scenes, many historians argue, he sanctioned tough union-busting tactics and manipulated the narrative to maintain control of the industry, which ultimately gave him the ability to build an even more dominant position in the steel market. This parallels J.P. Morgan's actions in 1907, playing the part of savior while quietly securing deals. In both cases, you've got these epic figures who shaped American industry and finance, generating narratives of heroism that might obscure the more ruthless tactics behind the scenes. Then there's the mention of Habsburg's electoral bribes. The Habsburg dynasty, ruling vast swaths of Europe for centuries, was notorious for strategic marriages and political deals. Many historians, including some on Wikipedia and in specialized academic works, note that the family often used money or the promise of land to influence local lords or even entire provinces to gain loyalty. Whether it was the Holy Roman Empire or Austro-Hungarian domains, the Habsburgs had a reputation for forging alliances that benefited them and kept them in power generation after generation. Now you might be thinking, what does that have to do with Morgan? Well, the original text draws this comparison to illustrate how individuals or families in positions of authority can leverage crises, or at least exploit the circumstances to gather more power and wealth. Just as the Habsburgs found ways to keep their dominions under control, Morgan found ways to expand his financial empire during a moment of deep crisis. In short, the significance of Morgan's deals, and the reason we call it the bailout that built a fortune, is that it's a historical example of crisis capitalism. An influential player sees an unstable situation and moves to stabilize it in ways that also boost his own position. The phrase profiteering is supported, secrecy is debated. From the original text means there's substantial evidence Morgan did, in fact, make a tidy profit. Where historians and experts differ is on whether the entire scheme was planned in detail or just an opportunistic set of decisions made on the fly. Some folks accuse Morgan of orchestrating everything from the shadows. Others say that's taking the conspiracy angle too far. Yet almost everyone agrees that these negotiations went on behind closed doors, and details emerged only in bits and pieces. Have you ever heard the story of how J.P. Morgan Jr., the son of the legendary banker John Pierpont Morgan, supposedly kept a neutral facade during World War I while quietly backing the Allies to the tune of billions of dollars? It's the kind of tale that mixes international intrigue, massive fortunes, and shadowy deals in a way that practically begs you to lean in and listen. According to accounts in the House of Morgan, a detailed chronicle of the Morgan dynasty, J.P. Morgan Jr. facilitated around $3 billion in loans to the Allied powers. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper you dig, the more you discover how his business dealings revolved around arms shipments and strategic contracts, all while he publicly maintained a stance of neutrality. Sound unbelievable? Well, like so many other episodes in history, the truth is often hiding in plain sight, concealed under layers of carefully crafted narratives. Think of it as a performance so polished that it made everyone from Washington lawmakers to everyday citizens believe the Morgan Empire was simply an honest financial juggernaut doing its part to keep the world economy afloat. But behind that facade, concealed to avoid U.S. scrutiny, some say, was a machine that profited handsomely from the war effort. First, let's set the stage. The year is 1914. Europe plunges into conflict after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Great War begins, but across the Atlantic, the United States initially tries to remain neutral. President Woodrow Wilson even issues proclamations reinforcing this stance. Publicly, J.P. Morgan Jr. expressed support for neutrality, but privately, the House of Morgan was positioning itself to become the primary underwriter and purchasing agent for the British and French governments. According to multiple historical sources, including British war records and contemporary newspapers like the New York Times and The Guardian, Morgan's banking empire facilitated colossal transactions involving munitions, supplies, and other critical war materials. Picture warships crossing the Atlantic, loaded with everything from rifles to heavy artillery shells, all financed or brokered in part by the Morgans. Now, how does one keep such a gigantic operation under wraps? That's where the idea of a facade comes in. The official story, at least in the early phase, was that Morgan was simply conducting legitimate financial business. The House of Morgan was a global institution, so it had clients everywhere, including countries that would later become the Allied powers. But behind the scenes, there were plenty of hush-hush conversations, coded telegrams, and carefully orchestrated transactions. If you believe the more critical sources, Morgan and his associates worked diligently to ensure these deals weren't splashed all over the front pages back home, lest they spark outrage among Americans who were convinced the nation should stay out of the European bloodbath. Think of it like a stage magician who distracts you with one hand while the other is busy pulling off the real trick. Some modern commentators draw parallels between Morgan's supposed neutrality and William Randolph Hearst's reputed Nazi sympathies before and during the early stages of World War II. Just as Hearst kept certain opinions out of his mainstream publications to avoid public backlash, Morgan allegedly cultivated a posture that he was merely a banker, open to business with all sides, even though in practice he threw his weight behind Britain and France. If that sounds over the top, remember that big money and power often move in ways that keep the majority of people in the dark until much later. Indeed, as we sift through documents, letters, and even diaries from the period, some of which have been analyzed by historians and archived in places like the Library of Congress, we see that J.P. Morgan Jr.'s involvement went far beyond routine banking. To grasp the magnitude of the $3 billion figure, consider what that amount meant in the mid-19-teens. It was astronomical, easily dwarfing typical government budgets of the era. According to economic analyses and inflation calculators, $3 billion back then could be the equivalent of tens of billions in today's money. For Britain and France, desperate for supplies and financing to keep their war machines running, Morgan's assistance was a lifeline. And for Morgan, each new loan or arms deal spelled profits, fees, and the sort of influence that only grows in times of crisis. This dynamic, where private financiers cash in on global conflicts, wasn't new, of course, but rarely had it been done on such a grand scale, and rarely with such a veneer of plausible deniability. If you want a real detective story, try following the paper trail. Historians have spent decades combing through British War Office records, contract agreements, and shipping manifests to piece together the scope of Morgan's operation. Many of these documents reside in archives in London, Paris, and Washington, D.C. They detail how certain banks, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, brokered huge bond issues for the Allies. In effect, Morgan helped to sell British and French bonds to American investors, raising money that would then be used to purchase arms, food, and raw materials from U.S. manufacturers. While it was all technically legal, the moral question looms large. Was this truly neutral behavior, or was Morgan quietly pushing the U.S. onto the path of eventually joining the war on the Allied side? Naturally, America did enter the war in 1917. By that point, Morgan and his associates had already laid deep financial tracks with Britain and France. Some argue that the loans themselves created a vested interest for the United States to see an Allied victory. After all, if the Allies lost, the chances of repaying those gargantuan debts might evaporate. According to the commentary of a few outspoken critics, including certain blog writers and financial historians who have published online articles, Morgan had effectively bet on the Allies long before the U.S. government made it official. That bet paid off handsomely when the Allies ultimately prevailed. And yet, while we have a wealth of documents showing how these deals transpired, questions remain about precisely how much Morgan pocketed. Estimates vary, but there's little doubt it was a windfall, possibly making him wealthier by orders of magnitude. One of the original notes about J.P. Morgan Jr.'s hidden arms deals suggests investigating Morgan's loan contracts and British war records for the nitty-gritty details. Indeed, the more you look into the specific contracts, the more you see references to commissions, fees, and underwriting profits. It's all reminiscent of other grand-scale dealings in history, such as Edward L. Dohany's Mexican bribes, a scandal that rocked the oil industry and the U.S. government in the early 20th century. Dohany, similar to Morgan, tried to keep certain aspects of his transactions hidden, weaving political connections and monetary influences in an attempt to secure favorable deals in Mexico. Also reminiscent is the Capuchin monarchy's purge of the Knights Templar in 1307, where many historians argue that King Philip IV owed massive debts to the Templars and orchestrated their downfall partly to escape repayment. In all these cases, we see a pattern. Powerful individuals or institutions exploit or create a crisis, or at least a high-stakes situation, and then maneuver behind the scenes to protect or expand their wealth. Morgan's involvement in World War I has been framed as one such scenario. The war profits Morgan hid. But calling them hid might be a bit dramatic if you consider the vantage point of the era. It's possible Morgan considered his dealings standard banking practice, the sort of thing any robust financier would do in a time of international conflict. Yet historians note the deliberate steps taken to downplay or conceal the scale of his involvement, especially the extent to which these deals might have influenced the broader American public's perception of the war. In newspapers of the time, you find only hints of the magnitude of Morgan's assistance to the Allies. The real story, how money was channeled, how arms were purchased, surfaced more fully in retrospect once the war had ended and certain records began to trickle out. During the interwar period, the U.S. Senate even launched investigations into the so-called merchants of death, a term used to describe arms dealers and bankers who profited from World War I. Though J.P. Morgan Jr. was questioned, the inquiries never really led to any legal repercussions, but they did highlight the enormous profits reaped by financial institutions from wartime transactions. Of course, in the years after the war, sensational claims surfaced. Some ex-posts, as the original note calls them, suggested that Morgan and his cohorts deliberately pushed America into World War I for personal gain. According to that note, those claims are speculative and exaggerate the extent to which Morgan influenced national policy. While there's no doubt the Morgan Empire had a huge financial stake in seeing the Allies succeed, historians are divided on whether Morgan actively lobbied the government to abandon neutrality. Official records and diaries from Wilson's administration don't show smoking guns of direct manipulation, though one could argue that the sheer weight of financial entanglements made U.S. intervention more likely. But that doesn't necessarily prove a grand conspiracy. It could simply be an example of how private interest shapes public policy in subtle ways, something that recurs throughout history. Anne Morgan, the daughter of the legendary financial titan John Pierpont Morgan, and her rumored romantic involvement with Elsie de Wolfe, an influential interior decorator famed for transforming homes into glamorous showpieces. While these claims have not been definitively proven and remain speculative, they have captured the imaginations of historians, gossip enthusiasts, and social commentators alike. Today, I want to guide you through an imaginative journey that weaves together every known detail about this potential relationship, no matter how small. The idea is to spark your curiosity and present a narrative that might well have been quietly circulating among New York's glittering elite over a century ago. Anne Morgan, born in 1873, was not just any heiress. As the daughter of J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful bankers in history, credited with helping to shape the American economy, Anne was thrust into a position of almost unimaginable privilege from the start. And yet, she was also a woman of her own convictions. Contemporary newspaper reports, along with biographical details found in well-known references like the Morgan Library and museum archives and academic blog posts, paint her as someone with a sharp intellect and a philanthropic spirit. She championed causes that at the time were considered forward-thinking and in some cases downright radical for a woman of her standing. For instance, she was deeply involved in labor reform, advocating for better conditions for working women, particularly those employed in factories. She also contributed significantly to humanitarian efforts in France during World War I, and much of this work is documented in various historical records, including letters, organizational archives, and personal journals kept by her associates. Elsie de Wolfe, on the other hand, represented a whole new wave of fashionable creativity. Often cited as America's first female interior decorator, she was a socialite in her own right, ultimately becoming Lady Mendel after marrying Sir Charles Mendel years later. In accounts available on design blogs, Wikipedia, and the memoirs of some of her contemporaries, Elsie is described as a vibrant presence, known for her flair for elegant design and for hosting lavish parties where artists, writers, and aristocrats converged. She was not shy about mixing in high society circles, and her ability to charm patrons propelled her to the forefront of the decorating world at a time when women in business had to navigate countless obstacles. She introduced a fresh, airy style that many saw as an antidote to the dark, heavily furnished Victorian interiors of the day. Magazines and newspapers of the early 20th century often mentioned her name in the same breath as other leading tastemakers of the era, In the midst of this swirl of affluence, philanthropy, and high society gossip, rumors emerged that Anne Morgan and Elsie de Wolfe shared more than just a friendship. Though direct confirmation has never been found, there have been nods to such speculation in places like Smithsonian Magazine and other reputable outlets. These sources hint that letters or diaries might contain coded language or affectionate nuances, suggesting a romantic bond. Indeed, for a long time, historians and casual researchers have wondered why the two were seen so frequently together, or why their companionship seemed so intense. In that era, same-sex relationships were not only frowned upon, but could also wreak havoc on an individual's social standing and philanthropic ambitions. So if Anne and Elsie truly were romantically involved, it's easy to imagine that both families, and especially the powerful Morgan clan, would have every motive to keep the details hidden. After all, to protect the family name and Anne's considerable philanthropic work, any rumor that could damage her public image or impede her ability to fundraise would have posed a grave risk. For context, consider that around the same time, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was rumored to share a close romantic connection with Lorena Hickok, a female journalist. While some historians argue that the evidence for a full-blown affair between Roosevelt and Hickok is more substantial thanks to surviving letters in which the two women exchanged deeply emotional sentiments, others remain more circumspect. Still, mainstream society of the early to mid-1900s was not prepared to accept a public figure, especially a female philanthropist or politician, being openly involved in a same-sex relationship. The weight of social expectations was enormous, which likely explains why those in such positions might have gone to great lengths to keep their private lives under wraps. We can observe a parallel here to the rumors about Anne Morgan. It would hardly be surprising if her family had attempted to quash any suggestion of an unconventional love life. In making these connections, certain parallels emerge with other hush-hush liaisons that scandalized high society. For instance, Lucy Doheny, another wealthy socialite, was long rumored to have engaged in a secret affair. Though details varied and changed over time, drawing from old tabloids and society pages, the point remains that sensational claims of hidden relationships were a staple fascination among the public, as they provided a salacious contrast to the ostensibly upright, polished images portrayed by the wealthy. Another famous example is Aristotle Onassis, whose relationship with the opera diva Maria Callas was likewise the subject of intense speculation before they eventually went public. Rumors of Onassis's affair with Callas were whispered in elite circles well before they were openly acknowledged, demonstrating how secrets of the powerful tend to seep out slowly, fueling gossip and rumor mills for years before any confirmation, if it ever arrives, is produced. Returning to Anne Morgan's situation, we might wonder how we can glean more concrete evidence of a relationship between her and Elsie de Wolfe. Historians, social commentators, and even some amateur sleuths have posited that intimate undertones in their correspondence or diaries, should such documents ever be comprehensively analyzed, could provide the missing puzzle pieces. In fact, Elsie de Wolfe wrote an autobiography titled After All, published in 1935, in which she talks about her life and career, but offers only glimpses into her personal relationships. Anne Morgan may also have left behind personal letters in family archives, perhaps sealed away or withheld from public view. There are intriguing hints and references found in smaller historical societies' records, and even in certain blog posts that some letters from Morgan's circle survive, but not all are easily accessible. If these materials ever surface, they could paint a clearer picture of the nature of the bond between Anne and Elsie. We should pause to reflect on why any mention of such a potential romance would be aggressively suppressed. For the Morgan family, and for Anne herself, so many philanthropic avenues would have relied on her sterling public image. Beyond merely donating money, she organized aid efforts, raised funds, and, at times, personally rallied volunteers to travel abroad for humanitarian missions. Some accounts from reputable sources, such as the American Friends of France archives and documents in the Morgan Library, suggest that Anne's status was integral to forging alliances with other wealthy patrons and with governmental institutions. A scandal in the papers, however, insinuating that she was engaged in an unconventional relationship might have led donors to pull back or even triggered more significant social condemnation. In the deeply conservative climate of the early 1900s, even the whiff of scandal could turn potential patrons and collaborators into distant observers. Interestingly, the parallels to Eleanor Roosevelt's rumored relationship with Lorena Hickok draw attention to how philanthropic or political women of the era tackled personal rumors. Eleanor's legacy is widely revered, due in large part to her humanitarianism, activism, and role as First Lady. Yet the possibility of her having had a relationship with another woman is not something many mainstream historians highlighted until more recent decades, despite the existence of affectionate letters that strongly suggest emotional intimacy. In similar fashion, Anne Morgan's philanthropic credentials took precedence in many official records, overshadowing any speculation about her personal life. Indeed, the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw countless individuals living double lives, publicly embodying societal norms while privately forging their own paths in ways that had to be carefully concealed. Why does all this matter so much to historians, curious readers, and enthusiasts of hidden histories? One reason, according to some cultural commentators, is that uncovering the private lives of public figures helps to deepen our understanding of the social constraints that shape their choices. Even if Anne Morgan and Elsie de Wolfe were just friends, as many official narratives might maintain, exploring the rumor compels us to look at the social and familial structures that would have made it necessary or not to conceal such an affair. This process opens a window into the complexities of gender, sexuality, and power during a pivotal era in American history. It also challenges us to question how many other stories, never documented or swiftly erased, have remained lost in the margins. While the rumor mill churned in hushed drawing rooms, one might wonder if there were any more overt signs that either woman had romantic inclinations outside the standard heteronormative framework. Elsie de Wolfe, for instance, is known to have had close friendships with a number of women, many of them prominent in social and artistic circles. Biographers sometimes describe these relationships as intimate or emotionally charged. That said, she did marry Sir Charles Mendel in 1926 and maintained a very public profile as Lady Mendel, hosting elaborate parties in places like Paris and Beverly Hills. As for Anne Morgan, she never married, which by itself in that era often raised eyebrows. Of course, many women of that time, especially those of independent means, chose not to marry for reasons unrelated to sexuality. Indeed, being unmarried gave Anne Morgan the freedom to focus on her philanthropic works without the constraints that marriage could impose on a woman's autonomy. But as is often the case, any deviation from the marital norm quickly sparked speculation. An especially fascinating aspect of this story is how it mirrors the tension between progressiveness and traditionalism. We can note that both Anne Morgan and Elsie de Wolfe carved spaces for themselves that challenged gender norms, albeit in distinct ways. Anne was a leader in workers' rights movements, set up and managed charitable organizations, and even traveled extensively, sometimes working directly in war-torn areas, including France during the World War I. Meanwhile, Elsie de Wolfe, through her career in interior decoration, managed not only to claim a professional sphere for herself, but also to showcase that a woman could exercise creative and economic power on her own terms. By any standard, these accomplishments were extraordinary, and they occurred in a historical moment when women's roles were tightly circumscribed. If we peel back the layers of gossip, historical context, and philanthropic endeavors, we see the bones of a remarkable narrative. One of America's wealthiest heiresses, an emblem of old money privilege, might have carried on a discreet affair with a pioneering female decorator who shaped modern interior design. The family of this heiress, concerned with preserving both its reputation and the success of her charitable missions, may well have seen to it that such rumors were either vigorously denied or quietly swept away. This scenario is reminiscent of Lucy Doheny's rumored affair and even calls to mind the manner in which Aristotle Onassis and Maria Callas tried to keep their involvement shielded from public scrutiny, at least until the swirl of rumors built to the point where silence was no longer an option. In the case of Anne Morgan and Elsie de Wolfe, however, official acknowledgement never quite came to pass.